Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending upon where you are. Welcome you to this wonderful session. My name is Professor Cihan Çobanoglu. I would like to just introduce our speakers and also our organization with you in just a second. So welcome to the General Data Protection Regulation webinar. We have two wonderful speakers today, Dr. Sachiko Scheuing, and I hope I'm saying it right because a lot of people cannot say my last name. And Dr. Outi Niininen. I will introduce them in a second, but before I do that, I would like to introduce myself. I'm the moderator for this session. My name is Cihan Çobanoglu. As you can see, it doesn't sound like it, but I am originally from Turkey. So I'm the president of Association of North America Higher Education International. And also I am the McKibben and Dow Chair Professor and the Director of M3 Center at the University of South Florida, Sarasota-Manatee. And I edit several journals. This particular webinar is co-produced by ANAHEI and also the University of South Florida, Sarasota-Manatee M3 Center. Just a quick housekeeping items with you. By the way, I am talking to you from Bournemouth University, where I had the pleasure to deliver a keynote speech at the CHIMI conference here. So greetings from UK. This is such an international webinar here. Sachiko is in Germany, Outi is in Finland, and I'm in Bournemouth, and we have visitors from all around the world. For the housekeeping, just to make sure that people hear us, in the control panel that you should see this screen here right there. If you hear us, can you please click on raise hand? That will show us that you are hearing us in good shape. Just click on raise hand, please. That will give us, yep, I see it, wonderful. I see several people are raising the hands, which indicates that our voice is going there nicely. Thank you so much for doing that. Also, throughout the session, we are going to allow you to ask any questions by using either the chat button that you see here or the question and answers. Feel free to use any of them, and our speakers and myself will be checking that. And then when they are finished with their session, or if there is a burning question, please write burning questions so we can ask them right away. But otherwise, please do that. And obviously, we are live on Facebook. So if you're watching this on Facebook, please feel free to write on the comment section your questions. Again, I will be checking Facebook from my phone here, and I will read them to our speakers. Continuing with that, ANAHEI is a not-for-profit organization, and we are, our goal is mission to promote and encourage a global culture at member institutions. By the way, we have about 5,500 members from 114 countries around the globe, and globalize student and faculty successes and enhance global initiatives. It is, as I said, it's a not-for-profit. The website is anahei.org. You can access from there. We have quite a few different offerings. Research in 3 minutes program, visiting scholars program, where we match the visiting scholars to universities around the world, partnership programs. We have 2 journals, International Interdisciplinary Business Advancement Journal and the Journal of Global Education and Research, which are both open access journals, which means that we don't charge any money for authors to submit articles or for readers to read published journal articles. We have quite a few conferences we organize. As a matter of fact, in 2 weeks, we're gonna have global conference on business and economics in Sarasota at the University of South Florida, Sarasota-Manatee campus. And we had last month global conference on education research at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. We have awards, distinguished lecture series, and lecture series like this one, which you can access all of the lectures and that we have done free of charge on our website. You can just visit anahei.org/webinars. And also we invite you to be a member. Membership is free. You can go to anahei.org and click on be a member, and you will be able to see all the benefits that membership will give you. Again, for the sake of being a not-for-profit organization, the membership is free. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers to you. Today, we will be talking about General Data Protection Regulation. I'm sure that all of you who are attending this webinar have seen quite a few emails from different businesses that we're working with. about this. So we'll learn more about this, and majority of the people in this webinar are academic students and professors. So we'll be able to look at this from that perspective also, to what we can tell our students and also how it can impact us. So it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our speakers. Dr. Outi Niininen is an entrepreneur, author, and consultant in marketing. She has just launched www.kuderi.fi web store, the home of smart marketing, and Fixua Inta blogs. As you can fix it a little bit later. Sorry about mispronouncing some of the terms there. Blogs as a digital touch point for her mainly B2B enterprise. Kuderi.fi also sells limited product selection directly to consumers. Her research projects have focused on humor, computer, smartphone interaction, crisis management, utilizing social media for research, destination loyalty, destination branding, as well as the Australian short break holiday market, Australian. Her recent research focuses on using psychological principles to engage adult learners in an online learning environments. Outi is also co-editor-in-chief for the new educational journal, Evolving Pedagogy. Greetings from Finland. And also, last but not least, Dr. Sachiko Scheuing is the European Privacy Officer for Axicom, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, a global leader in marketing services and co-chairwoman of the Federation of European Direct and Interactive Marketing Association based in Brussels. With more than 20 years experience in the field of marketing intelligence and as former chief analyst, Sachiko combines theoretical and practical experience of the edtech industry to manage Axicom's European government affairs and compliance. She also provides national and European level advice to clients and colleagues on data protection and privacy matters. Besides FEDMA, Sachiko is active in many European and global privacy and marketing associations as well as think tanks. In the Netherlands, she has been a long-standing board member in charge of the international affairs of the Dutch Association of Data Protection Officers. Representing NGFG, she founded the Confederation of European Data Protection Organization with DPO associations across Europe. It gives me great pleasure to welcome these wonderful ladies to our webinar. Sachiko, the floor is yours.
Jihan, thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I am going to talk about the GDPR today, the law which is going to come into force in 2 days' time on Friday the 25th. And what I will do right now, Outi and myself, we have discussed how best to present. I am going to first of all provide some basic information about the GDPR with a slight emphasis on marketing, since that is my field. And then Outi would take over the floor, and she'll be explaining her situation, and we'll be having some dialogues and questions and answers. So first thing first, I basically summarized this presentation in such a way that all that you need to know about the GDPR is available in 10 slides. I will talk to you about the key provisions of the GDPR, and also at the end, the 5 priorities if you have not made the effort to be compliant yet. You have 2 days. So let me start. The first point, GDPR. Sorry?
You mind sharing your screen?
Can you see the screen? No?
Not yet. If you click
okay.
Screen.
One moment.
Okay. Perfect.
One moment. One moment.
Yeah, it should be.
Are you able to see it?
Not yet. Did you click on?
Not yet. So I'll do it once again. Once again. So here you go.
Now it is coming actually. Yep.
Okay.
Okay, we can see it. Perfect. Thank you.
So I was first here, and then I moved on to here, and now I'm in the first slide. So first of all, the basics about the GDPR. It is not that data protection law in Europe is new. there was, or there is a predecessor law, which is called the European Data Protection Directive, which is then from Friday onwards going to be replaced by the GDPR. And the reason why there was this new law adopted in Europe is because it was part of the so-called DSM, or the Digital Single Market. The aim of it is to actually grow and nurture European economic activities, support free flow of data and so on, free flow of goods and services. And the lawmakers has identified that data protection is one of the key issue and a key enabler to realize that goal. So one data protection law in Europe has been the aim all along for the GDPR. Unfortunately, this law, regardless of the fact that it has got so many great elements woven into it, it is more known for its high sanctions. Everybody is very threatened. It's either 20 million euros or 4% of the company's global, or the organization's global annual revenue. I also usually emphasize the fact that we're here not talking about the global annual profit, but it's about the global annual revenue. So it will hurt. Now, another key issue, and the other reason why this new law is getting so much attention from all over the world, comes from the fact that this law does not know the European borders at its limit. It actually applies to companies all over the world. But then again, not to all companies. Now there are two conditions. If you are offering goods or services to persons in the EU, or if the company is engaged in in monitoring behaviors in the EU, then the law becomes applicable. One big change which is going to be brought by this law, particularly for companies in Europe, is the fact that there would be a central regulator, which is called the European Data Protection Board. Up until now, what we have is, in every country, we have a data protection authority, which is the regulator for data protection matters. Once Friday comes along, then the ultimate decision maker in terms of determining the understanding of each and every article would be coming out from the EDPB based in Brussels, and no longer the national level regulator. The regulators will, however, still remain in the respective countries. Let me go on to the key definitions. It's always very interesting to have conversations about data protection with particularly my American colleagues, because in the United States, one uses this term PII, or personally identifiable information, which is quite limited to persons' names and addresses and so on. Now, GDPR and also the currently applicable European Data Protection Directive has another definition. Personal data, unlike PII, refers to any information that can relate to an identified or an identifiable natural person. So that in itself increases the scope dramatically. Second of all, we have this term called processing. Processing is about anything and everything that you do with data, from using it to storing it to accessing it and so on. another key concept, controller and processor, is very important in the European data protection culture. Controller is the party that is able to determine what the purposes and means of the processing of the personal data would be. In other words, controller is the party that can determine what to do with the data. Processor, on the other hand, is a party that is following strict instructions from the controller. Like a contractor, so the controller says processor do this, and the processor has to obey what the controller does. Number 3, here we are talking about how GDPR has fundamentally changed the way data protection is working in Europe. Well, first of all, the accountability principle, a new way of thinking, has been incorporated into this way we work with data. Let me just give you a small background about it. Well, until now, we have been very focused on this way of thinking that is based on informational self-determination. In other words, consent. With consent, we have already seen that in many instances, consumers are asked to say, yes, I agree, or yeah, I tick the box or whatever, whenever they are asked, can we use the data for this and that? Well, that's fine in a way, but of course, there have been complaints. Well, it's annoying. People don't read it. But I think more seriously, by actually being overly reliant on consent, what you are doing is that you are actually shoving the responsibility of a particular action from the organization to the consumer. In other words, if the consumer later on complains about a certain way of the data being handled in a certain way, well, the data controller can come back and say, well, excuse me, but you agreed to it. So one started to realize that, well, this is not really fair, is it? We need to do something about it. Besides, in this era of data and digital inevitability, it is very impractical. So a groundbreaking thinking, and they said, well, why don't we then turn it around? Why don't we make all the organizations responsible for the actions? Accountability. But that doesn't mean that you say, well, you know, I'm accountable, my company is accountable, and that's it. No, you need to prove that your company is accountable in writing in many cases. First of all, a measure that one seriously needs to consider is to appoint a data protection officer. Now, in some cases, you are mandated by the law to appoint a data protection officer, but I highly recommend, even though if you do not have to appoint a data protection officer, to have somebody that is in charge of data protection, a data protection manager or privacy specialist or whoever. It can be an internal person, it can also be an external person, so that you have somebody within the organization who is taking care of data protection happening in the organization. I also go back to the earlier point, the measures taken must be inspectable. I'm quoting here the UK's Information Commissioner's officer, Liz Denham. She said once, if I ask to see a company's accountability program and they ask me to come back in 2 weeks, I know they don't have one. What does that mean? You'd better have all the documents prepared already in anticipation. Moving on to the next slide, about the legal basis to process personal data in Europe. Now, the Article 6 of the GDPR gives altogether 6 lawful bases for processing the personal data. They vary from consent, performance of contract, compliance with legal obligation, vital interests of person, public interest, legitimate interest, and so on. These are the 6. Marketing and advertisement, however, it's very unlikely that we use the bottom 3 legal grounds to process the data. We do need to rely on 3 things: the performance of the contract, consent, and legitimate interest. A small note about the legitimate interest. One tends to think, well, what does that mean, right? It basically means if you have a legitimate interest, you can process the data. Well, that sounds very easy. Of course, the truth is it's not very easy. First of all, the company has to have a legitimate interest, like, for instance, growing the business or reaching out to prospects or whatever. And then on the other hand, what you always have to do when you are carrying out, when you're using legitimate interest as the legal ground, is to think, well, what is the interest of the data subject, the person whose data I am going to process? And you do this thing called the legitimate, the balancing exercise, to balance your interest against the data subject's interest. And only if your interest overrides the interest of the data subject, then you can use the legitimate interest as the legal ground. Very important, at least for the marketing point of view, in recital. Recitals are like footnotes, if you want, so of the law that actually explains a little bit about the different articles. Recital 47 says direct marketing may be legitimate interest. In other words, the policymakers have recognized that it is a legitimate interest for businesses to want to grow their companies. Last but not least on this slide, consent has to be unambiguous and affirmative. Legitimate interest, once again, has to be done on the basis of balancing the different interests. And by the way, I have not spoken about this, but there is a category of data that is considered sensitive. They are, for instance, information about health, information about the religion, and so on. Information that one typically that may lead to discrimination. This is how I would phrase it. Those information listed in the GDPR text would require explicit consent for the companies to process. 5th point, data subjects' rights. We have data subjects' rights today, such as notice, so inform people what you're doing with the data, access. We are able to ask the companies, what data they have about us or organizations. We can also ask to correct data, the right to rectification. And we also have the right to object and to erase the data. What is, however, new is this new right called data portability, the right to data portability. It only applies when the data is being collected either via consent or contract. Originally, the thought behind it was that if you are using, for instance, you have an iPhone and you have been downloading music from iTunes or whatever that music store is called on Apple, it's very difficult for you to actually then move on to another phone, which is not an Apple, an Android phone, and because you can't bring the music together with you. So the idea was to make it law so that you are able to move from one supplier to another in different contexts. once again, privacy by design is another very important element of the accountability measures that one can take. Whenever you are developing a new product, developing a new use of data, carrying out new research using data, one must consider all eventualities and build in privacy at the very beginning, or data protection at the very beginning, in the way that you'll be using the data. Number 7, providing transparency. So here, the data subjects or the consumers will actually be able to understand what exactly is going on, so that it would be easier for him or her to decide whether he would like to keep the data being used that way, or whether it should be whether one should request that processing to be stopped. In any case, transparency, I think, is also a very helpful tool, because the more you learn about how companies and organizations are using the data, the more understanding you would have how data is fueling our society today. And also for that purpose, I very much welcome these articles 12, 13, 14, and 15 that is providing the fundamentals in a legal context for transparency. Number 8, risk-based approach and data protection impact assessment. So this is really, this is also a very cleverly thought part of the GDPR. I am very impressed by this. It is because things are not always black and white, and one needs to think: are there risks? You can't say because there is a really small risk, you have to stop the entire operation or the entire use. For instance, the research can be stopped because I don't know what, a very small risk is there. What GDPR says is, well, first of all, if there's a risk, find out what you can do to mitigate the risk so that the risk would be minimized. And once the risk is minimized, then you can still decide whether you want to go ahead with using the data that way, or you would say, no, this is an absolute no-go. So the thought behind it is, first of all, to start with you taking an inventory of all the processing that takes place in your organization. And then you would find out some of the activities where you feel that the risk is quite high. If you feel that the risk is high, then, and by the way, please document this as well. If the risk is high, then what you want to do is you want to carry out this exercise called the Data Protection Impact Assessment. You carry out the DPIA, as they call it, and if you find out that there are and that in dialogue, of course, with your data protection officer, he or she would be able to advise you what are the measures that one can take to mitigate the risk, and so on. But if you are able to mitigate the risk by actually putting in some protective measures, such as, for instance, instead of using clear text personal data, that you pseudonymize the data so that you use ID numbers instead of names and addresses. Or, you know, if you're talking about security, perhaps you put a strong firewall in place and so on, and you feel comfortable about it, then one can go ahead with these mitigational activities. However, if you are still uncomfortable, then you have the possibility of contacting the Data Protection Authority and go through the risk assessment activity in that way. So there's this three-step mechanism: take an inventory, assess, you know, whether there is any high-risk activities, then do the DPIA, then you can also consult the data protection authorities. Moving on to the 9th slide. This is the scary bit, I suppose, and this is the teeth of this law. and that is, as it was in the predecessor law of the GDPR, individual litigations is of course there, but there's a new class action litigation possibility, and that is something very, very powerful. In Europe, we don't call it class action, but instead we call it collective redress. And this is not only geared towards the data controller, also processors are regulated directly. And also importantly, if there are multiple parties that are responsible, that are data controllers, then all parties can be held liable for the damage. I said 10, but actually I have one small bonus, because I suppose this is also an area that has been well spoken about, which is profiling. It's any procedure used to assess, classify, and or make prediction about people. And in the marketing context, we often refer to profiling as, say, market segments or segmentation systems and so on, so that one can say, for instance, young people or old people, urban, suburban, or the combination thereof, so that you can be a little bit more effective in where you are investing when you are carrying out marketing campaigns. GDPR is saying that if by the way, here also you have the right not to be subject based on a decision that is solely on automatic processing, including profiling. So you can also say, no, I don't want you to make automatic decisions based on profiling. GDPR also understands that are different types of profiling, different degrees of invasiveness of profiling, and where a consent is definitely required, it is spelled out in Article 22. If the automatic decision that is using a profiling, say credit rating or something like that, and through which you can't get a mortgage, for instance. If that decision actually produces legal effects or similarly significantly affects him or her, then you should certainly have a consent. So not all profiling would require consent, but only those that produces legal effects or similarly significantly affects him or her. And to conclude my presentation, the 5 priorities. This is your way to compliance if you have not started this exercise. Priority number 1, take an inventory. Take a look at what data you have in your organization or in your company. And also, quite importantly, as I understand that many of the participants today are from outside Europe, I think it's a good question to ask, does GDPR apply to my organization? If it does, you have to do the rest of the activities. You have to comply to all the points that are written in the GDPR text. But if you don't, then you don't. But I think it is still a very good thing to be sensitive and also to respect the right to data protection of the data subjects that are kept within your files. Priority number 2. Designate a DPO, a data protection officer, as I said, or a data protection coordinator, project manager, whatever. I think it is important to have somebody who does the data protection, who is in charge of the GDPR. Priority 3, update your privacy policy. I suppose, Outi, you may have been working on that in the recent past. Priority 4, update your subject access request system. Update your system in such a way so that you can respond to persons who are trying to exercise their right of data protection, such as the right to access the data that you keep about him or her. And priority number 5, check your contracts. With this, I would like to conclude my part of the presentation. Thank you so much. Now to you, Outi.
Thank you, Sachiko.
Thank you, Sachiko. Right, I'm just going to try to share my screen. And I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation too.
Perfect. And I will tell you when it shows on our screen.
Does it show now?
Yep, it does.
Okay.
Thank
Good
you.
day, everybody. A truly Aussie greeting should start work at any time of the day. So my name is Outi Niininen. I'm actually an academic, but is also dabbling in business, or whichever way you want to say it. So when I was thinking about getting ready for the GDPR, I sort of got a bit concerned, like everybody does. Oh, I can't get my computer to work now. Because it is a very much of in the legal field, Sachiko and I together felt we must include a disclaimer, and this disclaimer actually applies for both our presentations. So we're not lawyers, and we don't wish to suggest that we are giving any legal advice. And for that reason as well, I framed my own presentation in the way that it is a talk of what I did to get ready for GDPR. And I actually have a little online WooCommerce based store. And for those of you who are not familiar with this, how it works, I've got 2 blogs and a little online store, but I mainly deal business to business. But how I structured it online, there's this software called WordPress, which is a big plugin platform. And on top of that, you can install a WooCommerce, which makes it an e-commerce platform. And then everybody, depends how they want to design their own store and what functions they needs to choose from a wide list of plugins to do a specific function. So you can have a plugin that makes it yellow or whatever. So to keep safe with the legalese, I decided to actually tell you about the track for small business to get ready for GDPR. And in the red, I set my stress timeline. It started by December 2017. I went to a seminar where I quizzed a consultant, and I came home feeling really good. I am well on the track. But I thought, best not do too much yet, because there'll be changes between Christmas and end of May. So February this year, I did my new privacy statement, and after that, or that sort of time, because I belong to many business associations and I'm on several mailing lists to do with small business, I started getting heaps of emails: buy this GDPR training, or buy this expert looking at your paperwork, or buy this privacy statement. And the insecurity level was phenomenal. Then, of course, came the Facebook Cambridge Analytica crisis in March, and that was a sort of a real slap on the face, thinking, oh my God, if the big companies can get it, make a misestimation like that, what chances do I have? And it sort of went into, it was like my little 4x4 family vehicle, was somebody put some rocket fuel in it, and it was a real desperation, but do I need to do that too? But May 16th, I sort of got hold of it, everything. I feel pretty good. I'm ready. But then starts the emails coming in: buy this GDPR insurance. And it's another one of these sort of a negative marketing initiatives where they try to create insecurities in the minds of the person of those responsibilities. Of course, I had this very naive starting point, because I do business mainly in Finland, which is an EU country, and I used it as a security blanket that I use a domestic internet service provider who's well known and recommended, and they specialized in the WordPress kind of platform. And naively, in my very first privacy statement, I actually wrote that no, we will not give any information of individuals outside EU, thinking that's it, I'm covered. But of course, it doesn't work that way. With anything to do with WooCommerce, you add on your plugins, and all of a sudden, you actually got links that go outside EU. So I then started using the Privacy Shield. There's a EU-US Privacy Shield website that gives you a chance to go check out all the companies you're dealing with. And that's a very good way of checking if you want to do business with somebody outside EU or any of the big organizations, to see how committed they are into the this privacy change. The irony is that the business side is actually covered, because my reason for keeping personal data there or organizational contacts is to ensure that I can guard the warranties and so on. It is the freebie blogs that keep giving me the biggest headaches, because I have a function there where people can actually subscribe to these blogs, and you get people get emails saying, okay, the latest blog is out. And I'm actually using a service called MailChimp, and I'm naming MailChimp because they have been absolutely fantastic. They are one of the first companies I came across with who actually automatically do a legal contract between my own organizations and themselves about processing of data. I also wrote down about iTettle. Excuse me. iTettle is one of these ways I can collect fees by card, or give people receipts from cash payments if so happens. And they were owned by a Swedish company. Excuse me. One of the reasons I went with them is it's another one inside EU. And I felt there's a little bit of security in there. What is interesting about iSettle, I can actually give people receipts straight to their email or on their phone number. Now, just a few days ago, I learned that iSettle is being sold to PayPal, and only today I received we received notifications about their new privacy policy. So it keeps changing. There's just changes every day. There's some fantastic features that are happening this week in the WooCommerce or WordPress environment. Now it's actually easy to, if somebody gives a request that they want to see what information I hold on them, it's actually very easy to go find and testing it. It even goes and finds out if somebody's made a comment on a blog. So it's very good. And the same function allows also people's information to be deleted. Another good change has happened this week is also because many internet-based companies track customers' use online. It is now actually possible to anonymize IP addresses, and they basically block out the last 3 digits. So people, we can't actually say, for example, which town this person was looking at our page. But all of these, you have to know to look for them and go and tick box in the settings and make sure that it works. So there's heaps of changes happening. I've also prepared some questions together with Sachiko, because we wanted to compare big companies and small companies. So if I could invite Sachiko to join me, please. I have a few questions, and these questions are specific about giving you a fuller picture of GDPR.
I have now joined by voice.
Okay. So, Sachiko, a question to you about large companies and GDPR. How does the, maybe I'll read all these together and then you can answer to them in the order that's best for you. So how do or did large companies prepare GDPR, like in your organization? What is a data protection officer? What is this position all about? And why is this accountability principle so important?
So let me start from the first question, because this was really a big journey for me, and I think also for my organization, and I think for everybody really in Europe, but particularly for us, because we have been, I personally, if I would talk about that, I have been personally involved in this entire issue of the new data protection law in Europe since 2008, when the first consultation came out. I believe it was around that time. And so since then, my thought was, well, you know, new privacy law is coming. And of course, the law got adopted 2 years ago. And in my organization, we then started immediately to implement that. But the first thing we did was we said, right, let us take a look at the law and see how that translates into our daily operation. We did that. We created this thing called the Data Protection Dictionary, or the GDPR dictionary. But there were certain uncertainties, because usually when you try to when you are complying to the law, particularly in the matter of data protection, there are opinions of the data protection authority, and there are also jurisprudences which you can orient around with. But GDPR being a new law that is not yet that was not yet in effect, we needed to actually, you know, keep our antennas out to find out what the direction, where the directions were going to. It really started rolling, the implementation work, maybe the last year, and it started accelerating more and more towards the middle of last year. One thing I did realize is that to get an organization GDPR compliant is not something lawyers can do. So if you think you have a lawyer and then you get the GDPR ready, you are very wrong. What you really need is a really good project manager who actually makes sure that things are progressing, who actually, you know, checks on people, who would actually follow up on actions and so on. We have this blessing of having a fantastic group of project managers, and this is how we have been preparing to now. It's very interesting though. Senior managers at the C-suite, they are all interested in how far the preparation work has gone to. Does that answer the first question? Yes. Right. So then I now talk about data protection officer. This role, data protection officer, as I mentioned, is not a new law. In some countries, they are already legal provisions that would allow to appoint a data protection officer, but GDPR actually mandates all countries. All companies in all European countries to appoint data protection officer if the organization is engaged in certain activities as provided in the GDPR law text. This position is, I say that this position, where somebody in this position would wear two hats. So on the one hand side, the data protection officer is like an internal regulator, internal data protection authority. So you get, so that's why it is very important that the data protection officer, him or herself, has a very independent position, which is the reason why the position is very well protected. And also, the person has to be reporting to the highest levels of management. On the other hand, data protection officer is your best friend. Data protection officer is your counselor, where you can actually talk about all your stress, all your problems around data protection, so that together one can come up with the most suitable, most effective solution to any given organization. So once again, I also see a data protection officer as a role that one really has to have if you really want to become an accountable organization, because you need somebody who's in charge of it, right? You need somebody who's going to manage that process. It doesn't have to be this statutory data protection officer. It can be a data protection manager or consultant or whatever. I think it is a key position to have, a key role to have in your organization. It can be an external, so that the spirit of GDPR is going to blossom also in your organization.
Now, Sachiko, how does large organizations that you know of get ready for GDPR? Because in the news, we read about organizations now being fined because a very small department has maybe accidentally broken the privacy principles or the data protection, because it's not GDPR law. How can you ensure that such accidents don't happen?
Well, I think, it is impossible. It is impossible to actually say that that you can take measures so that you are 100% waterproof. There are always, a small percentage where you are vulnerable, and we are all human. So also from that aspect. It is very difficult to say that your organizations can ever be 100% waterproof. However, what I really do think is also the process or the commitment to the protection of data is as important as, or even more important than, whether a company is having a small breach that is actually, bringing down the company's reputation with fines and so on. I think, for instance, if you would go to if you would have a breach, say hypothetically, and the data protection authority would come to you and say, so, what are the preventative measures that you have taken so that this such breach can be avoided? And if you can't share anything that you have done, or if the efforts are seen as not sufficient enough, then I think the chances are that you'll be punished more than if you could actually say, look, I have a robust privacy program. This is how our organization is structured. These are the documentations, and these are the regular checkup that we do, so that we know that our system is working. Well, then I think you are, on many accounts, more likely to be, I wouldn't say excused, but not being blamed for not taking any further action.
So would it be fair to say that the data protection officers on a national level would also be there to guide and advise people?
Well, I think this is one of the roles of the data protection officer. I think they should, and the good thing about having a data protection officer, particularly internal data protection officer, is that unlike data protection authority, data protection officers are embedded in the organization in such a way that they know about what processing takes place, in what context, and what are the things that you need to watch out for, and so on. So this person would have so much more insight of the context of the data processing. And I think, in case there are inquiries from the Data Protection Authority, the DPO would be able to speak the legalese, so the GDPR language, which the Data Protection Authorities would be speaking, but then translating the operational language, the operational from the operational context, which I think ultimately would improve the level of data protection for all concerned.
Yes, and also my understanding is that the national boards or organizations charged with GDPR implementation are there to advise. For example, I have contacted our local GDPR and office to ask them questions, and they've been exceptionally helpful. I wanted to also, as an academic, highlight this point that, and it kind of comes together with what Sachiko said earlier, that sometimes it's not enough just to have a legal representative external to your organization to come and prepare your privacy statement. I would relate making or doing the preparation for GDPR and drafting a privacy statement equal to making your own marketing plan or your own business plan. I think the real value comes from the thinking of the process and going through the possible weaknesses in your organization, and then coming into ways of figuring out how to make sure it doesn't happen. It's a bit like getting that ethics approval for your research project. When you start it, the paperwork looks overwhelming and phenomenal, but once you actually completed it, it is really nice to know that you have that kind of a ethics stamp of approval insurance with you when you go and collect your data. So I think there's definite value there doing it yourself as well. Now, Jihan, are you trying to hasten us on?
Not really. I have quite a few questions. I would like to make sure that I have some time to ask them to you, because our presenters have been submitting, audience have been submitting them. Please let me know when you're ready for me to read these questions.
Okay. Well, we might actually answer some of these in the next ones that we sort of thought about talking about. So the right to check your own information. I just briefly mentioned it, and now I can only talk about the WordPress platform. It is now parsable, and it's very clever the way it draws all the information, all your almost like breadcrumbs you used on the website. But what if, Sachiko, what if there's a situation that I'm sort of also a bit problem with? When I've minimized my GDPR risk, I'm actually minimizing the number of information I gather from people. So when somebody wants to check what information I hold of them, and they, for example, say that, oh, I don't use that email address anymore, how could I then go about trying to verify that this is the person whose information I can send to them?
Well, I think that is going to be very, very difficult. So you are talking about if somebody actually asks for a subject access request. In other words, if somebody would say things like, "What information do you have about me?" Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if somebody says that, and then if somebody refuses to identify or provide information which would identify the person sufficiently, then I would say I would be very careful about it.
Exactly.
Because let's think about a context where two people are sharing a flat, and then they have a fight with each other, and then this person impersonates the other person, saying, "Well, I want this information now, and please send it to my email address. This is me." I think there'll be a problem. Some companies are actually using external companies that does identity verification. If if they are concerned about a situation where it can lead to a data breach because of responding to the subject access request. So it's a very, very important issue that if you are particularly responding to a subject access request, then you really know that the person who is asking for the information is indeed the person about which you have the data about.
Exactly. So in this process, it is not just a blind automation. Probably is not the right way to go forward, at least not at this stage yet. Okay, then I've got questions about organization, because I said earlier that I was using the fact that I was based in EU and I was only dealing with other EU companies that are falsely assumed in the beginning as a security blanket. So one of the issues that comes up in sort of business forums is regularly, I do business outside Europe, and for example, I need to share information with an organization outside EU about my customers because it's essential to their warranty? Or what if somebody wants to go and sell something through, for example, Amazon, eBay? How does this work then with privacy statements?
That is very complicated. Let me start with your question about Amazon eBay story. These are this question unfortunately has to be answered by it depends. So first of all, it depends on your capacity. So I don't, because I'm not in e-commerce, I haven't ever sold ever anything through Amazon or eBay. It depends on the agreement that you have with that online platform or the outlet. And if there's a clear agreement that the relationship is owned by Amazon or eBay, and they are the ones who actually have to have the are actually interacting with them, then I think it is fair to say that they should have appropriate privacy agreement, privacy statement, and things like that. But if it is in a construction, say, very hypothetically, another platform where you yourself are actually just renting that place, and it is the consumer would have direct communication with you, and the interface also shows that the privacy statement should be really communicated from your company directly, then that would be the right place to provide this information. However, I think it is a very complicated issue, and it's best to once again think about, if I were the consumer, what would be the most convenient and the most reasonable way for me to obtain this information? I mean, this is apart from the agreement that you would have with such platforms.
Yes, and I also like to highlight here transparency. I think it's very important to communicate to your customers how these situations are dealt with right from the beginning, rather than anybody learning about it as a surprise. What about if the warranty issue is with a company outside an EU? Just a contract like I have with MailChimp?
Well, what do you mean? For the warranty reason, an EU-based company has to share customer information. Oh, not covered by. Okay, so that's a very easy one. So Privacy Shield is one of the many mechanisms where data from Europe can be transferred over abroad. Actually, Privacy Shield is just a EU, a US transfer mechanism, yes. And it is, but there are other instruments. For instance, there are countries that are considered adequate, so countries that are having the same level of data protection as in Europe, such as Argentina, Israel, and so on. So to those countries, there aren't much that one has to worry about. There's also another mechanism called the EU standard contractual clauses. Now, those are template agreements, and you are not supposed to change the wordings of that agreement if you want that to be valid. From the European Commission, I think they are due to be updated because of the GDPR. But anyways, by signing this agreement with the company located in a third country, you would be able to transfer the data there. Another mechanism is this mechanism called the BCR, Binding Corporate Rules. Now, this applies more for multinationals that have got companies all over the world. I think then it would make more sense that within that company, you would be able to send data from one office to another, regardless of the location. So I think if the question was, oh, there's no privacy shield, I think you need to think, no, what other instruments can I use to transfer the data?
That's right, and be more proactive in that way. Okay. Then this is one of the things that really concerns me is the smartphones. When a large organization is building a privacy statement, Because smartphones today are not just phones, they're more like an extension of a computer, and we have lists and contacts of people in there. So if an organization has company phones, how should they treat them in the privacy statements?
That is a very, very, very interesting question, because it actually also crosses many areas. To begin with, the question is does that smartphone belong to the company, or is that considered the property of the employee? And also, the individual also. I mean, I wouldn't like it if my employer would come to me and say, "Hey, look, Sachiko, give me all the contact details that you have stored on your telephone directory of your smartphone." I would say, like, that is yes. None of my business. So I think one should really sort of consider all these other implications that are there. However, usually these things would be clearly regulated. Should a company have, for instance, works council, there may be agreements between the company and the works council, so that a certain way of using data and so on are agreed. But very generally speaking, GDPR acknowledges, or better said, there have already been a significant body of discussion about the validity of consent when there is a big discrepancy in the balance of power, and employer is of course much more powerful than employee. So therefore, even though if the employer would say, well, consent to this, one can take, one needs to think, well, is that really fair? Because it's not freely given. Employee cannot freely say, no, I don't want to agree to that, without fearing that would that have implication to my employment situation. I think here, once again, apart from the laws, if you are just somebody who's trying to make decisions based on certain common certain sentiments, just listen to your heart and think, well, is that fair? Is that going to lead to some discrimination? Take a look at the law. I think it would reiterate what you have just heard from your heart. And then another thing, in terms of mobile phone use and digital data use and so on, GDPR is one law, but there's another law which is currently in preparation, which is called e-privacy regulation. And that covers data protection, but also the right to privacy, privacy of communication privacy. I think the moment that law is adopted, we will know more concretely about what to do, what not to do.
Yes, I mean, personally, I'm sort of be wary about apps and so on. Okay, what about the future? Internet of Things. One of the things I've discussed often is the Internet of Things, where you can tell your toaster whilst you're in bed still that, I'd like my toaster pop out in 2 minutes time. But one of the issues identified in the earlier developments of Internet of Things is a factory set of username and password which can't be changed. Do you have any concerns about any of these?
This is slightly outside of my domain, but that is not quite.
Discuss a bit more into this. I'm actually talking about where a small company is running lots of things from, say, one server or one computer, and then this will be a gateway into that very important company network as well. So I wouldn't want to tempt the kids downstairs to consider developing a beautiful career in hacking. What about future of digital out-of-home billboards and advertising, where, for example, facial recognition is used to give a really well-targeted advertising to people who are passing these points on the roads, for example.
Well, the interesting thing about you mentioned here facial recognition. So facial recognition, i.e., from that from your facial feature, you identify you as you, right? And that Outi Niininen. So that requires, according to the GDPR, that requires an explicit consent.
Yes.
Yes. So I think it'll be a very interesting space to watch how that explicit consent is going to be obtained, particularly and by the way, this requirement has been there for a long time. Also, at the the data protection laws that are currently in force in all EU countries that are based on the European Data Protection Directives, they all say that use of sensitive data must always require explicit consent. So this is for those tech savvy but data protection wise not so knowledgeable persons. I hope this is a great opportunity to get to know how, or get to understand and find out how best to capture explicit consent in such a context. Coming back to your question about security settings and so on. Now, the provision of data security is also part of protecting the data. And so now, as a responsible organization, one should always consider what technical and organizational measures you are putting in place to ensure that the data is protected. And, having unchangeable passwords and, easily accessible network, I think those things would be problematic.
Yes, definitely. Now, I couldn't resist the academic in me. I was reading the local newspaper and I came across this article. It was about building blocks, apartment blocks, where access data or video recordings are used for security of individuals and property and so on. Now, these lawyers were actually suggesting that because of GDPR, these electric log data and video recordings should not be used by, for example, the building superintendent identifying who's leaving rubbish in the corridor, but only in a circumstances where a crime has been reported to the police. There's going to have to be a lot of changing of traditional thinking, would you say, Sachiko?
Well, I'm surprised that this thinking was not there before, because, as I repeat, data protection is already law in Europe since the 95 directive. And in some countries, like in France, in Germany, actually the area where I'm living, Hessen, has got the oldest data protection law, which gave birth in the 70s. So, we do have a data protection culture that goes on for decades, and I hope that this GDPR is going to give this this one extra push to bring data protection on the top of mind of more people.
That's right. Now that you mentioned about your region and data protection, I also wanted to say to the academics there, if you want to do a sort of big speech about privacy, might want to mention the Australian privacy principles, and I've given a link there where information can be found. It's actually based on a law from 1988, but it was renewed in 2014. Very much similar lines that with the EU one as well. I'm sure there's plenty of these examples to be found around the world. Okay, thank you very much. I hope I've been hopefully offering something additional.
Perfect. That's great. Are you ready for some questions now?
Yep.
Okay. And you may have covered already the answers, but I just want to, for the sake of acknowledging our audience questions, I'm going to ask. And if you want to add anything else, one of you feel free to do so, or one of you just can pick to answer. Somebody asked, is the data protection only for the outsiders, meaning customers, or does it contain also employees?
That's a very important question. Of course, it contains, it is applicable to employees. I think it is something that is even more important for employees because in employment context, employers usually collect sensitive information, and that include, for instance, if you're off sick, then that information is quite sensitive. You have been sick that time. You're on maternity leave. That also indicates the condition that you are in. So yes, oh, definitely. Thank you so much for that question.
Great. Another one, it's about academic research. So one audience member said how GDPR can affect some types of academic research that use big data. For example, the big data that is extracted from online platforms. He didn't ask this, but I want to add, just because the data is public doesn't mean that we can use it in our research.
I'd be, this is venturing towards the legal advice, so I'd be a little bit careful here, but I'd say, for what purpose was the data collected?
No, they didn't indicate. If Mustafa, if you are listening, please write on Facebook. I can ask this, but I am assuming that maybe they are referring to, let's say, the TripAdvisor data or the online reviews and other things that are available, basically online. And the names could be identifiable there. Obviously, we don't use the names, but in a qualitative research, you may as well, because it's public.
That's true. I think one of the issues here is academic research as such is one of these extra categories, special categories in GDPR, isn't it, Sachiko? And the problem would be, can the person be identified? I think this would be something that the institutional ethics, research ethics committees would have to review their own policies, and I'd use that approval as an insurance then, because if the university stands by a research design, then the university is then taking responsibility for it. Okay,
that's great. Another question, I'm just going quickly. This is from the marketing side of the GDPR. What are some strategies to have your subscribers to give consent? This particular person said we have alumni in our email list. Is the question continue? And I guess they want to know what should they do to get people's consent? Because, you know, like I receive also a lot of emails that ask me, and sometimes you don't care too much. It wouldn't bother you to receive the emails, let's say they sent, but you don't necessarily go click that button and check the email. So any advice there from any of you, both of you, or?
Well, I think that at the moment, unfortunately, there is no one uniform strategy or uniform answer to that, because the degree of consent that is required for using that for email marketing purposes differs from country to country still. This is the legacy of e-privacy directive, which is currently being negotiated, discussed, so that in the near future we will have a e-privacy regulation. So some clarity would come soon. Talking about the marketing use of data, if I would actually talk specifically about Germany, there is a provision that allows you to use the email addresses without opt-in, provided the fact that you have, you have been transparent or all the rest. If that person has contractual or contractual-like relationship with you. I don't know how that would apply to alumni. Maybe one can say that, well, that person has been a student, i.e. a customer of the institution in the past, and therefore, provided that all the other conditions are met, it would be fine to reach out to that person with commercial messages. But once again, I don't know. Whenever we talk about consent, I think the best thing you can do is make it fun, so that people want to get consent, so that it is attractive, and also that you have you have a good interaction, and also very important is transparency. Just make sure that you're clear and you make sure that it's purpose specific. All the necessary information and conditions of the consent to be met. But make it fun. This would be my advice.
That's right. Maybe show the value, right? What you give them so that they will. But I just want to ask one clarification question. So you said that customer. So do they have to be buying something from you for you to be under the GDPR? So in other words, if you are not profit and you provide not sell.
So here I'm purely referring to the German situation, in which case there are two laws that would be applicable, i.e. the anti-competition law. Would it be translated that way? I'm not really sure. UWG it is called in German, and the currently effective Data Protection Act. The UWG actually governs that part, and it says it's either contractual or contract-like relationship, which means which does not necessarily to be able to use this soft opt-in provision.
Okay, last question. Are the penalties being really enforced? What happens if we make a mistake? Is one email campaign without permission make our company vulnerable to penalties?
Theoretically, penalties are there. So theoretically, yes, that would make yourself vulnerable. But once again, I do believe that data protection authorities would actually be communicating with you if you have made a breach, or if you have actually made things that are considered illegal. Then I think the first action would be to take corrective action. I presume that the real 4% of annual global revenue, that level of penalties would really come when the breach is absolutely unbelievably grand in magnitude. And once again, this is, by the way, this 4% or 20 million or whatever, it is not the fine, but it is the maximum fine.
Okay.
But great. I don't know whether that would put people in ease.
Well, the advice that we've been receiving is that indeed the role of the privacy officers in each country is also to educate, inform, and put organizations on the right track. So we are actually anticipating that initially they're going to be advising and then telling you fix it, even how to fix it. And if you don't take action, then possibly fines might start happening.
Okay, that's great. One last question. Somebody said, one of the audience, can we have access to your presentation materials? If you feel comfortable, let us know. You don't have to answer publicly right now, but then we will make it available online as a PDF of your PDF. Obviously, the video is available, will be available, and then people can view it from there. But I guess some of the academics may want to use it in some materials in their classes to their students. So if you feel comfortable, you can email the PPTs to me later. This concludes our session. We are a little bit over time, but I think it was very nice, great conversation. I learned a lot. I would like to thank Sachiko and Outi, to both of you, for taking the time and enlightening us with this important regulation, and giving us some research ideas and also some materials that we need to cover in our classes, regardless of the discipline. I would like to ask you if you have any final remarks before we conclude the session.
Well, I've been in touch with some organizations with mailing lists, email mailing lists, go back many years, and these people were concerned, how do I know if somebody is an EU based or not? And they actually resolved this problem by starting a second database where they then added the individuals whose permissions consent they actually explicitly got, and then started cleaning the database in that way of contacts for people who no longer wish to be part of the mailing list. So organizations are going to extreme measures to comply to this new regulation. But I also think it is very good to bring it on top of the mind of everybody.
Great. Wonderful. Sachiko, anything from you?
No, well, apart from the fact that I would really like to thank you and ANAHEI for inviting us to have this great conversation, and looking forward to joining you some other time in the future. But thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you. I also would like to thank you one more time, and our audience on Facebook and also coming here. Would like to wish you a good night, good evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you might be. Hopefully watch us at anahei.org for our future webinars. Have a wonderful night, everybody. Thank you.
You too. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Bye-bye.